end of the day, so don't let me forget those, Judy. Today, we're going to take possible action on HB 2132. That is our definition of neglect bill. What I want to do, committee, is I do not want any motions today. If you have an amendment, you can ask Jesse to bring that amendment out so that we can look at it and discuss it, make sure we're not conflicting with any amendments. Would love to see those out on the table today without a motion for just discussion. This is a little bit different than what I've done in the past in committees, but I want to have a full vetting of this bill as much as possible. So on Wednesday, the agenda says that we'll continue this bill, and that's when I want motions. So a full discussion today. And with that, we're going to start with Representative Humphreys because she needs to leave. So do I need to open this discussion? Okay, discussion's open on HB 2132.
Okay, I do have an amendment, Madam Chair. And Jesse, you have copies of those? Okay, great. Okay, so I'll just explain a little bit that I actually emailed Jesse when we were hearing that bill, or just right at the end of the committee meeting, and asked her for some changes. And so I do think, I'm assuming there's going to be other amendments, and I think some of the things I mentioned are probably, you can go ahead and pass out, is that okay? So people can be looking, or, oh, you went, sorry? Oh, did you do all different ones? Okay. Can we just pass them all out? Okay. I thought it was going to be one. It's 4 things. Is it 4 things? Yeah, it's 4 things. And great, it's all separate. Okay. And so, so we'll just look at them, and I'll kind of explain them, and then, but we're not having motions, but I can explain the ones that and I think, again, some of these are going to be exactly what people have already discussed. I just happened to get to Jesse probably first, or quickly, I don't know. Okay, so the one that you have in your hand right now, it's just taking out the likelihood of harm and just saying, results in bodily injury or harm. So it's taking out the words likelihood. Okay, so that's the first one. It's easy.
So question, it puts it back in there.
I'm sorry, excuse me.
I think
it was taken out and it puts it back in.
Okay.
Just to make it more, puts likelihood back in.
So basically, there's no changes to the current law. It would just remain as it
likelihood
has been. Okay.
Okay. The second one that now they're passing out, thank you, it just changes the word back to the word failure instead of refusal. And the reason I did that, refusal to me seemed like that there was a knowledge that something should be done, but you're refusing to do it. And it just seemed like failure was really more like what we were looking for in this bill. And again, I think it's probably something that other people will have agreed to too. Okay, the next one is it's on, if you see it, strikes section Roman numeral 6, little v, little I. And the reason I felt like this was really important, and maybe some of these other ones are going to be struck too, I don't know what other people's amendments are, but I have really personal knowledge with that one. And it said that that facts will not show harm, imminent harm shall not include any of the following alone. And I feel like this one does show imminent harm alone, because I do a lot of, quite a number of the adoptions I do, it's women who are going to be testing positive for cocaine or fentanyl or meth when they give birth. And in that case, if we were to leave this, then the baby would, newborn baby, which often, if that's the case, they are in the NICU because they're also addicted. maybe they're in the NICU for 7 to 10 days. If we say that this reason alone, then the baby be going home with that mom, and I just feel like that, what is DCF supposed to do in that case? And so, usually if a mom does have a UA or whatever, she's test, and she has been doing drugs during the pregnancy, then at that point, DCF or someone will step in, or an adoptive couple or something. So I feel like that one alone is okay reason to show imminent harm. The baby shouldn't be going home with a mom that shows that she's been using fentanyl.
Okay, let's stop right there.
Okay.
Committee, are there questions on these three? So the first two are just putting the bill back, the language back as it was before this proposal of the bill. And then the third one would be striking prenatal drug and alcohol exposure. Are there questions for Representative Humphries on her amendments? Representative Carr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And if you would, Representative, kindly indulge me on the first of the amendments where, if I'm reading this correctly, you want to reinstate the language or presenting a likelihood of harm. Is that correct? And
Yes, Representative.
And you gave us some examples of some of the other the reasons you did the other amendments. I'm curious, what is an example of why you would want to retain that language?
Yep, because if you read it, that, refusal to provide adequate supervision of a child or to remove a child from a situation that might result in bodily injury or harm to the child. So the way that it was before the amendment would just say that results in bodily injury or harm to a child. And I feel like we need to be a little proactive, so realizing that it would be a likelihood of harm to it, bodily injury or likelihood of harm to a child. So a little bit proactive, not waiting for the child to have an injury or harm. And it might be this isn't the exact right word. I've been hearing talk. There might be another word that is going to be a little bit better, but that day we heard the bill, that was my initial thought.
So if I could a brief follow-up, how then would a likelihood be determined, and who would make that determination? Just because the likelihood kind of, there's a likelihood that I could walk out into the middle of the street and be hit by a car, and it's definitely a likelihood because I would be walking. There are cars on the street, the likelihood presents itself. So how do we make that determination in confidence?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. That's what it is now, and so I think there's some established procedures and practices already in place because that's what the law says now, and so that would be a great question to see how they're determining that now.
Representative Neighbor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Back on your third amendment, when you strike the prenatal drug or alcohol exposure, what's the difference between that and substance abuse? Because alcohol and drugs are also substance abuse. So how do you differentiate?
So I can answer that. Yeah. We have an amendment on that in just a little bit.
Okay, sorry.
Nope, you're good.
I think it's true on several months. You're going to find someone did something maybe better, but.
Okay, any other questions? Representative Johnson.
Just a comment. The representative over here asked about likelihood of harm. I know the definition states the probability that someone or something will be harmed. It depends on the situation and the severity of the potential harm. And then factors, risky activities include or increase likelihood of harm, while safer activities decrease it. The more severe the potential harm, the higher the likelihood of harm. So those are some definitions, and I think those probably would have been what I used in law enforcement when we would be teaching our officers in the academy. Thank you.
We're going to get into that just a little bit deeper after Representative Humphrey's Fourth Amendment. So are there any other questions, these first three? Hold tight, there's a lot coming, so, okay. Go ahead with your fourth one, Representative
Okay,
Humphreys.
so the fourth one doesn't have as much to do with the definition of neglect, but I did decide to take advantage of the fact that we're talking about this statute to put in an amendment that I've had in previous years. And it is changing the definition of kinship. And if you look at that page 4, line 29, kinship care placement means the placement of a child in the home of an adult with whom the child or the child's parent already has close emotional ties. And I feel like we should include statutorily that maintains the child's close and healthy attachments that may include current or previous foster parents. I feel like foster parents that their child already has close emotional ties should already be included in kinship because, you know, we all know there's foster children who have lived with their foster parents for the majority of their lives, 1, 2, 3 years, maybe they're 1, 2, 3 years old. And so I think kinship should include those foster parents. I think it already does in a way, but it's just not statutorily written in that foster parents could be included, could be considered kin. And when you look at what we say the definition of kin is, it's the child or the child's parents has close emotional ties. I just think we've got to include those foster parents that they do have close emotional ties to. So it's the same change in both Section V and Section W. And so with that, that's what my amendment for that piece is.
Are there questions on this amendment? Any questions? Okay, Representative Owsley?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Representative, for acknowledging that you took advantage of the situation. Because I think the first three amendments are certainly on the topic of House Bill 2132 and, in my opinion, appropriate to discuss here over the next couple days. I think this fourth one is a completely different subject matter in of itself, related without a doubt, but worthy of its own hearings and own discussion and own conferees.
Representative Humphreys? Okay, I thought you were pressing your button. Okay, any other comments or questions on this Fourth Amendment? Representative Riley?
Madam Chair, I appreciate it if the carrier of this amendment just to ask a question on this, and that would be, I don't understand where it sounds like a subjective kind of terminology of saying close and healthy attachments. I mean, some of the foster kids that we've heard, you know, they have had 30 different foster parents, and how do you sort that all out of what is close and healthy?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. I think it's similar to what is already written in statute right now that says the child or the child's parent, the child or the child's parent already has close emotional ties. That's what we have right now. That's already subjective, like what's a close emotional tie. And so this is just adding something else subjective. And I don't disagree with what you're saying. There might be a better way to say it, and I'm certainly okay if we think of a better way to say it. I just would like, current or previous foster parents included in this definition, that they could be a possibility of someone that the child has close emotional ties to.
And just to follow up on that, so was it emotional ties or healthy attachments? That's very subjective, so.
I don't disagree.
Any other questions, committee? Representative Owsley?
Thank you. And I think just that one question shows that this discussion is worthy of its own conversation at its own time. And I do know that when we were having the hearing on 2132, case law on our sync code was brought up a handful of times, and careful as we change the definition of neglect. So I can't imagine that that's going to be any different when we talk about changing the definition of kinship care placement or kinship caregiver. And again, I'd just caution the committee that we could stray from the underlying intent of 2132 here, which I thought was to make sure the front door was not too wide open.
Any other discussion? Okay, so I have an amendment. I broke mine down into 3 amendments for discussion. But before we pass that out, maybe we should pass that. Go ahead and pass the first one out on the definition. So we're going to talk about just the definition part. I have spent hours upon hours talking to conferees and those that didn't get to testify about this definition. And there is a divide. So I worked mostly with the opponents, which were district attorneys, judges, some police officers. And so I made some changes, but I'm not settled on these changes, okay? So this is mainly for discussion purposes that we are going to do this. And then after Jesse hands this out, she's also prepared a handout with definitions of the legal terms that we're going to be talking about, some of which are defined in Kansas, some of which are not defined in Kansas statutes. So if you want to pass that out to Jesse, and then would you mind going over that? Okay, and so she'll go over that with us, because I think what is important that we choose are the right words, because that's how they're going to be interpreted. And if they are not defined, then maybe we need to think about possibly defining them into statute. Maybe that's what we need to do with this definition. And so I'm going to have her talk about these terms, and then we will look at the amendment, and would love to hear your thoughts on, what word you think would be best. Okay. Wherever you're comfortable, Jesse. Thank you, Jesse.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, committee. Jesse with the Reviser of Statutes Office. What I have handed out with Jacob's help is a memo requested by the chairwoman related to definitions of words that are used within definitions that relate primarily to the standards of determining child abuse or neglect and reporting of such abuse or neglect. So what you can see in the memo is it is a list of terms such as harm, imminent harm, immediate, likelihood, reasonable suspicion, reasonable cause, probable cause, failure, refusal, reasonable, and then reasonable and prudent parenting standard. And so what the memo does, it at first identifies whether or not the code defines that term. So you're going to see harm is defined in our statutes, in our code, but imminent harm is not in the definition section of the code. And so if those are just as it relates to the code, there's no analysis on whether or not, those definitions may exist in a criminal code unrelated to children or a probate code unrelated to children. But it first goes through our statutes in the code. Then if that term is defined by Black's Law Dictionary, then that definition is provided. For example, I'm just going to use harm. So harm, when I looked that up in Black's Law Dictionary on Westlaw, you have the simple definition of injury, loss, damage, material, or tangible detriment. But then there are other phrasing and uses of that harm that the definition further you can further define under Black's Law. So if, we wanted to look at bodily harm, you can see that by Black's Law Dictionary is physical pain, illness, or impairment of the body. So most of these terms are defined by Black's Law Dictionary. And then Some of the terms I was able to, if it's not in the statutes and it's not in Black's Law Dictionary, then the third option would to look at just a normal dictionary. So Merriam-Webster. So on the second page, you can see likelihood is not in the code. I could not find a definition in Black's Law Dictionary, so therefore the provided definition is the one found in Merriam-Webster Dictionary. So you'll see some of those have that. Some of the definitions also have definitions from other states that have chosen to define that term. Disclaimer that this is not exhaustive in any sort of way, but for example, reasonable suspicion is defined in California. Reasonable cause is defined in New York, Montana, and Alaska. And yeah, reasonable cause was the main term that I found being defined by other state statutes. So when you're looking at the use of these words when being used in the definition of neglect in the bill before you, these are some examples requested by the chairwoman to look at how they were defined. And then the last item, the only item that relates to reasonable in the current code is determining a reasonable and prudent parenting standard. So our code doesn't say reasonable as just a word, but it does reference reasonable in the use of reasonable and prudent parenting standard for your information.
Okay, I have a question real quick. On harm, when it lists all the accidental, bodily, emotional, does that, in our statute, when we say harm, does it include all of those? Or is harm, are all those separate harms?
So all those harms are the extra phrases that you can find defined in Black's Law Dictionary. In our statute, since harm means physical or psychological injury or damage, a physical injury, is bodily harm, when you think about that, physical or psychological injury or damage.
Okay, thank you. Are there questions on this? Representative Barth.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Is starvation included in harm at all?
So starvation is not in the definition of harm, but as harm is, it's physical or psychological injury or damage.
Would that be more abuse? Or
I feel like we should have somewhere in there starvation in case they're housing somebody in a area where they're purposely not feeding a child.
okay, so we have in our audience experts. Would one of them like to, do we know how starvation is handled in our sync code? Go ahead, Representative Johnson, while she's, come on up, Tanya.
The term that we used when I was with the agency was failure to thrive, and it describes an act of the body. I think that is in the code and the procedure. We didn't call it the term starvation, but it was failure to thrive.
Okay, and Representative Roser?
Yeah, so I just looked. It should fall under impairment of the body, which is under bodily harm. So I think technically starvation would be considered harm. That's tough because it's an interesting thing to bring up during Ramadan.
Okay. Deputy Secretary, if you'd weigh in on that, that'd be great.
Yes, thank you. Deputy Secretary Tanya Keys with the Department for Children and Families. So I think in terms of practice and how we would see it, it would be part of number 1, failure to provide the child with food, clothing, or shelter. So the word food could be applicable in that situation. In terms of categorically, physical neglect is what it would fall under.
Thank you. So not harm, but neglect?
Thank you for the question. So in terms of a type of abuse or neglect, we would consider it could consider it physical neglect, but certainly harm comes in within the definition of that determination.
Thank you very much. Does that answer your question, Representative Barth? Okay, yeah. Any other questions for Jesse, the revisor, on these definitions? There's a lot of words on this page, on these pages that she prepared. Okay, so let's look at my amendment. This is specifically doing the definition of neglect. So, on page 4 of the amendment, be the second page, we start by adding to this. So neglect means an act, omissions, or the cumulative effects of a pattern of conduct, behavior, or inaction on the part of a parent guardian. So I added that in there. It is in the definition of Washington, I believe. Washington, yes. And this addresses a couple of the examples that were brought to our attention where there's a repeated calls, there's repeated intakes, and nothing is done. So if there's a pattern of conduct, behavior, or inaction, that could be neglect. And then we added, instead of presenting a likelihood of harm, presenting a reasonable suspicion, and I left of imminent harm. And then we also, the cumulative effects of pattern of conduct and behavior and action is there again. And then we just corrected child's instead of parents to parent. So let's stop there and have a discussion. Because what we really need to decide is this harm? Is this imminent harm? Is this likelihood? Reasonable suspicion? Where do we think the law needs to be? Right now, it's likelihood of harm. DCF is saying that's too broad. And then the other side is saying that imminent harm is too much. So where's the middle ground? Is what I was looking for in my discussion. And I came up with reasonable suspicion. Now that is a criminal term that is not used in child welfare in our state, but it is used in child welfare in other states. Representative Barth?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was just thinking through when Representative Carr brought up that question earlier with Representative Humphreys around the harm piece of it and whether it be imminent or suspicious or not. Like thinking about a home where there's an active, adult couple that is physically fighting, there are injuries happening, and there's a child that's in the range, is in that home that is potentially at risk of harm in that situation. And somebody who comes in that home to assess that can physically see that there is potentially imminent harm in something like that, where I think there are situations where that does apply, where if that child, maybe both parents or the folks that are there are both at fault and both taken away, are we going to leave that child in that home by itself without any adult supervision? Like that's imminent potential harm right there. So I think about those things where I'm like, it does apply in my mind.
And it would be imminent harm, or that would even be harm, right? They could go, it could be the lower standard or the upper standard. Representative Burkamp?
Maybe on that point, is reasonable suspicion a lower bar than likelihood of harm?
It is a middle ground. It's a little bit higher because it's based on fact. If you look at what the handout that Jesse gave us, I focused in on the California definition. Don't necessarily want to model everything after California, but this definition I thought was really good. For the purposes of this article, so reasonable suspicion means that it is objectively reasonable for a person to entertain a suspicion based upon facts that could cause a reasonable person in a like position, drawing, when appropriate, on the person's training and experience to suspect child abuse or neglect. So it's that suspicion, the way I think about it is likelihood is kind of like a gut feeling. Like it's kind of a gut, like you kind of think there might be something, but you don't really know for sure. But the reasonable suspicion to me says that, okay, my gut's there, there's something factually going on, and based upon my experience and what I've, been exposed to, whether it's a police officer or DCF, this could lead to harm.
And I don't disagree with that. I guess when I was just reading the other parts, like when a cop has reasonable suspicion, a lot of times it could be pretty loose. You know what I mean? Like it just seems like it'd be pretty loose on what constitutes that. So that, I just wanted to pose a question to people and see, but I appreciate.
Let me see if Jesse has any clarification on likelihood and reasonable suspicion. Do you have any clarification on that?
Sure. When you're kind of thinking about the levels of you've got likelihood, so likelihood isn't necessarily a term that's used in a criminal context or anything, so that's kind of particular to the child code. But what you are kind of thinking about in the criminal code in possible applicability of this is reasonable suspicion is that objective basis supported by specific and articulable facts. And then you have probable cause, which is high up there. So the latter would likely be likelihood, reasonable suspicion, probable cause when you're looking at the different standards.
Okay. Any other questions, Representative Burkamp, right now? Okay. Representative Neighbor?
Okay, this is more for a point of clarification. So let's say there's a call to the house, but the people responding do not witness the fight going on or the disruption going on. What can they do in that situation? Because a lot of times they'll shut it off, and so you're never there at the right time. And so you just wait for it to escalate, or what?
I think this is the hard part, committee. Every situation is different, and we are relying on the people that are on the scenes to make that call. So we want it to be broad, but more specific than a gut, right? And so with that, it would just depend. Is the house trashed? Is there broken, furniture? How bad was the fight, even if they deny it, who started it and all that good stuff? They're going to have to make that. There are facts there, and then they're going to have to use their training and what they know to make that judgment if it's reasonable suspicion. Does that help? It's just, we want to keep it broad. I don't want it to be probable cause where they have to have evidence, right? That's not going to be helpful in these situations. But likelihood, there's no definition of it. So maybe we just define likelihood. Maybe that's the answer to what we're looking for. But I think we're going to end up closer to reasonable suspicion. And I'm okay with defining likelihood if that's what we want to do. So maybe that's the answer we need. Go ahead.
Well, and I think likelihood is, again, kind of subjective. It's maybe it would, but I don't know for sure, and that's how I feel today, but the next time it didn't seem that way. There's a lot of flexibility, much more open in that than there is in what we're talking about here. And if we need to tighten that up, then maybe likelihood shouldn't be a part of that, because it leaves it up to our gut. And we mothers do pretty good with gut feelings. Dads, I'm still working on. But it's not that they can't, they do. And, but I think when we get into the meaning of some of these words, we have to be very careful of how broad they really are overall, and do they get to the subject or the meat of what you want to do. Thank you.
Okay, Representative Carr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And maybe everyone else is clear on this, and it's just me that's not. Are we as a secondary effort, are we defining what these are? I just, as Representative Burkamp was speaking, and I was looking to see exactly where he was speaking from with respect to the reasonable suspicion. You know, I was reading the top one, and it says the apprehension or imagination of the existence. And I was confused with by that language because, man, imagination, that leaves it wide open. So my question is, as a secondary causal effect here, are we going to provide the specific definitions? I mean, you've listed several, but or several possibilities, but in my opinion, that leaves someone with the opportunity to just point at the one that they choose to use and say, well, I was looking directly at what the definition was, and this is how I came up with this conclusion. So, and maybe that's not what we were doing, but is that what we're doing? We're going to attach a specific definition or a specific term and then define such term so that there's no error in clarification.
Yeah, so that is kind of what I alluded to. Maybe that's all we need to do is define these words. And so that is something that we can do with an amendment, is we can put these definitions into statute. Because right now, likelihood is not defined, imminent harm is not defined, harm is defined in our statute, reasonable suspicion is not defined, failure is not defined, and we've been using that word for a while, and it's all throughout the sync code. So it's something we need to consider. So it is an option for us to define these words. Okay, do you have any other questions?
No, thank you.
Okay,
very much.
Representative Roser?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So this is just the amendment that's in front of me, so I'm just going to talk about that one. But I'm also going to reference the other representative's amendment that talks about the likelihood, since that's the change in language. I think food insecurity is the best way to look at this definition. When you think about food insecurity and you think of likelihood of, and you could, that might, in my opinion, that's just way too broad. That could be the basis of, it's likely that they will lose their WIC, or it's likely that they might lose this benefit. And if we're taking out poverty, which was the whole goal of 2132, was to address the word poverty, that those aren't correlated, then I think that addressing that would be a big part of it. And so I'm actually very supportive of the reasonable suspicion of imminent harm, just because then that takes it from a level of maybe they might lose their food benefits, or they might lose their access to some sort of subsidized, I don't know, program, I guess. Whereas now, with reasonable suspicion, say a parent is, you can see that they are not using any of their WIC benefits, or the child is not taking home any of their summer EBT or whatever, or a child is asking at school for more and more of the free and reduced lunch, free and reduced breakfast that they're having. Now we have reasonable suspicion, and when I'm just looking at these two amendments, since that's what we're talking about, I prefer this amendment of reasonable suspicion over likelihood of harm. So I just wanted to throw that out there since we're working the amendment.
Thank you. And we can, there may be another word that we come to the conclusion on. So again, it's my amendment, but I'm not stuck on my terms, okay? For discussion, anybody, there's Representative Owsley, sorry.
Thank you. I snuck in there. So I just wanted to remind the committee that we're only defining the word neglect here, because in conversations I had over the weekend discussing this, I tend to look at this definition as being reasons for removal, but it's not just the reasons for removal. And I was going to ask Jessie, not to put her on the spot, but just can you give us a couple other examples of where the sync code uses the definition of neglect?
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So I did run a search for when neglect is used in statutes in the code. It's used in 2201, which is the Bill of Rights, 2202, which is definition, 2212, which is, to be determined a child in need of care and access to those records. So who can access records if that child is to be determined a child in need of care. Reporting of abuse. So when someone is a mandatory reporter, the definition of neglect is imposed on, whether that person has the duty to report. It also is imposed on, the investigation of a report of abuse or neglect, such as, when joint investigations between DCF and law enforcement are to be conducted, when physical, that visual observation is to be required. And then the bulk of the code, relates to the proceedings and how to move forward and how those proceedings are related to a child of abuse and a child who is alleged to be abused and neglected. There was one about employers. Okay.
Thank you, Jesse. And committee, I just wanted to bring that to your attention because, like I say, as I had the conversations over the weekend, I had lost sight of that. I think my personal intent with this is to make sure we're removing the right kids, and not the wrong kids. And I got lost on that, and just listening to some of the questions there, I thought it good to bring that to the committee's attention. Thank you.
I think it's also in the mandatory reporting neglect. It's in that part as well. So, okay, any other questions on this part? Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The one thing I do still know, I still see that little divide between criminal justice, the law enforcement portion, I should say, and the social work. It is very difficult for us to arrive at the same definitions because in training and what we learn and how we affect our tasks are predicated on different viewpoints. The social worker is going to help and fix. Law enforcement, I'm going to enforce the law. And I still see them not quite accepting some of these terms, at least those that I talked with in the last 3 or 4 days. They're very suspicious. I think that's the nature of the beast. And so I would like to be able to talk with them and say, we're actually closer than you think. Thank you.
And you will have time between now and Wednesday. Representative Roser.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, sorry, that was a big part of it. And so one of the testimonies, opponents that we had from the law enforcement agency was about, one of the statements was, does a child have to get hurt before we are able to go to the courts and have them removed from the home? And I think that the presenting a reasonable suspicion kind of helps eradicate that fear that we won't be able to address the issue before the child is harmed. I also, since we're talking about the other amendment that was brought by the other representative that changes the word refusal and puts back in failure. I also think that unreasonable failure is a better definition, because if you fail to say, maybe I'm going to go back to food insecurity, you struggle to provide food, now that you have that opens the door that we can help them get into a program without necessarily removing the child from the home. So I think that's also a more appropriate way and kind of puts us in the direction that the proponents were looking for, which is guiding us towards resources rather than guiding us towards discipline.
Very good. Okay. Any other questions on this part? I'm going to move on the bill, on the amendment, which she did this great segue into this. So the next part is, so we have failure now. The bill changed it to refusal, and there was conflicting testimonies on that as well. And so what I looked at is adding refusal or unreasonable failure, having both. And so I thought that was an interesting discussion. Failure, I feel like we fail every day. It's a common word, it's not defined, everybody fails, right? But an unreasonable failure to me says if you are out of diapers or out of formula and you have $20, if you just fail to get that, you know, maybe you just didn't budget correctly or whatever. But if you, an unreasonable failure to me is you go out and buy cigarettes or drugs or alcohol when you should have bought formula. That is an unreasonable failure. You had $20, what did you do with it? That's how I think about it in my mind. I'm open to discussion here. And then I also added or presenting a reasonable suspicion of imminent. I kept the imminent for right now. And we'll keep discussing that. Okay, so thoughts on that part. Are there any questions, comments on that part of the amendment? Okay. Representative Owsley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry, I was slow to turn on my light. I think I was a fan of refusal. You know, as we go to the definition provided by Jesse here. I know I read it somewhere. It's a long memo. You know, the denial or rejection of something offered or demanded. You know, it seems to me like that's cut and dry. You know, it wasn't a failure because they didn't have the funding, but it was a refusal to provide the child with food, clothing, or shelter. But as we discussed, you and I, that these don't all need to be, you know, one or the other. You know, they don't have to be failure or refusal or an unreasonable failure. We could pick and choose between 1, 2, and 3 here on page 5 of the bill. And because I think with food, there is a failure, without a doubt. But when you get to services, the refusal, I think, makes more sense. But I think the pushback that we got from conferees, I prefer the unreasonable failure versus the way it is written. So if that's going to, you know, keep opposition from the bill and cause less confusion in the operating world, then I'm supportive of it. But I just put that out there for discussion.
Thank you. And I had the same thought. Some of these, like 1 and 2, I think you could have an unreasonable failure. 3, I think you could refuse. And so when I amended, I just did both. Any thoughts on that, Representative Roser?
I think both are appropriate. Refusal is, in my eyes, refusing to even apply for a benefits program that could benefit the child. Unreasonable failure is applying and not utilizing. Right,
So that's where
which
we have
would
to get
need.
really specific with our definitions, I think. I think that's going to be the key to this bill, making this bill strong. Any other discussion on this? Okay, Representative Burkamp.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm in favor of your changes. I think both makes it more appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I think the question left on this amendment, what we need to decide on Wednesday is the likelihood, there's 2 words, likelihood and harm. Is it likelihood? Is it reasonable suspicion? Is it probable cause? And is it harm or is it imminent harm? And it could be even immediate harm instead of imminent harm. That's one word that I read. I think it was in part of our statute this morning, thinking, well, maybe it's immediate. Maybe that's the word we need, immediate harm. And I think Jesse defined that. Immediate, was that in? Okay. So none of this is really defined. And I think harm in our definition is kind of vague in the definition of it. So I think that's work that we need to do as a committee. If you want to work with Jesse, you can give Jesse permission to talk to other people. That way we're not duplicating efforts, and we can maybe get a consensus if you would all kind of weigh in with her. I think that would be maybe a good way to handle that. And then we can debate it out on Wednesday, right? Okay. So the next amendment, if you'll go ahead, it's gonna cover page 10, I believe, in the original bill. Does anybody need a copy of the bill? Judy does have a few copies of the bill. Does anybody want a copy of the bill? Okay, she can pass those out. I have a few.
Madam Chair, if I could make a comment.
Go ahead, Representative Owsley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just to the, a previous comment made about some of the opponent's original testimony on what do we have to do, wait for a child to get hurt in order to, move on. And I think that's where the, or cumulative effects, it's not a word in my vocabulary, I apologize, or a pattern of conduct behavior. I feel like that kind of addresses the concern that was raised in that testimony. I just want to make that comment real quick.
Thank you for going back to that. I did want to mention, I talked to our district attorney. There is one case out there that has had, I think he said 96 intakes or calls. They're still not in custody. So that definitely is a cumulative effect of a pattern or behavior. And so hopefully maybe they can act and help them, bring attention to them, whatever is needed in that situation. 96 intakes is a lot. It is excessive, yes. Okay, so for this next amendment, oh wait. Okay, sorry, I thought this was the other one, page 10. Did you give us that one? Oh, page 8. Okay, hold this amendment till the last. Don't even look at it right now. I'm just teasing, you can look at it. Go ahead and pass. I apologize, I confused my pages on the bill. I can talk about it really quick. On the amendment that she just handed out, it was suggested by one of the DAs that I talked to right now, this bill, if you look at section 5 on the very last page, this act will take effect and be enforced from and after its publication in the statute book, which is almost immediate. That gives no time for DCF to adjust policies, provide training, and he asked for 18 months. I did January 1st of 2026. It's something we need to consider. When is a good time for this to actually go into statute? So all that does is change the dates, the timing of this bill, and then on page 10, it changes that, except that a parent may have the opportunity to consult, not shall. The shall word kind of is very definitive, so we did may. Representative Carr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Question, were you provided an explanation as to why the 18-month was a request?
I was not. I think it's a lot of Senate Bill 367 fallout from that, and because it was immediate and it was chaos and there was a lot of confusion, and so they want time to make sure everything's in place so there's not that. I don't think it'll take 18 months, but I do think we should add some time, yeah.
Thank you.
Because policies need to be adjusted, training needs to get out there to law enforcement, how we define neglect from this point on, and to DCF workers and to the case managers. Like, I want to give some time for that. I thought that was a great idea. I just don't think it needs to be 18 months right now. May change my mind. I'm still debating. Okay, so the last, did you hand that to me? I'm so sorry. Thank you. Okay, so this bill has to do with kind of the removal standard. There was a lot of concern about saying include any of the following alone. It was kind of confusing, so I did change that to be based solely on. And then we add in reasonable suspicion. We just made that consistent. So if the petition requests removal of the child from the child's home, I'm reading from 7A, in addition to the information required in the KSA and amendments thereto, the petition shall specify the facts demonstrating that allowing the child to remain in the home would be contrary to the welfare of the child, or that placement is in the best interest of the child, and there's reasonable suspicion that the child will sustain imminent harm if not removed from the home. Facts demonstrating imminent harm shall not be based solely on. And we've already seen the amendment from Representative Humphreys to take out prenatal drug and alcohol exposure. So that's already been discussed. The substance abuse that Representative Neighbor asked about, I did speak with the DAs, and one of them suggested non-felony substance abuse without harm. That is a standalone reason. So it's not based solely on non-felony substance abuse without harm. Now, if there's drug paraphernalia laying around, that's harm, right? So that's two things, and so they can remove. But if they're just high on marijuana and the child's being taken care of, that's not a reason to remove, because that is not a felony. It can be after 3 arrest, but it's not a felony the first and second time. Representative Carr. Okay, let me finish talking about this, and then I'll come to you, just to clarify. Isolation, I think that can stand on its own, okay? And then the last one, including imminent harm to the child in such petition shall show that such harm outweighs. We put may consider that such harm outweighs. I think that was all that was on this amendment. Okay, Representative Carr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm looking for how we would have a defining factor that keeps these two separate, and that is number one, or community or family poverty versus IV or 4, crowded or inadequate housing. Are those not oftentimes one directly related to another? If the family's living in poverty, there is a exceptionally strong possibility that the housing is inadequate. You're poor, and there's an additional strong possibility that that the housing then would be crowded, because that would. Those kind of work together. I'm just kind of looking for a solution there. If any of my colleagues would have one that they're willing to offer.
Okay, Representative Riley.
Well, I kind of go along with that question also of, growing up in a 2-bedroom home with 4 kids and 2 adults, what's crowded, that's subjective.
Right, and so
A lot comparison to what they do today. It seems like every kid's got to have their own bedroom and their own bath and sauna and et cetera.
So that's why it's in here, because crowded or inadequate housing cannot stand alone. There has to be another factor for removal. Now, it could be poverty, but I would hope that it would not if we change our definition of neglect. Does that? Because this has already defined that, right? And maybe you can clarify that? I don't know. And we also have the bringer of the bill that's in the audience, so she may be able to expound on that as well.
Madam Chair, so what I am thinking you are stating is that when you look at crowded or inadequate housing as something for removal, you're thinking about that in the context of how the definition of neglect says not solely due to lack of financial needs. So transposing both of those things as neglect should not be due to financial needs in relation to this petition.
Deputy Secretary Keys, do you have any insight on that, on why those two were put in there? What the difference is in those two? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Tanya Keys, Deputy Secretary, Department for Children and Families. I think they're listed similar to how other states have listed them in that they could be separate. They could overlap or be concurrent, but to make sure that the list was comprehensive to notice them individually as well. That's why they're listed individually. You may not have a circumstance of inadequate housing if a family is facing economic hardship. Sometimes the two are different.
Okay, what is community or family poverty? Like, where does the community come in with that?
Well, thank you for the question. I think in this context, maybe there are some communities who have different opportunities for economic development, different opportunities for median incomes or income levels, retirement income. Different communities have different economic circumstances. So I think it just recognizes that it might be a collective impact of a community in terms of resources.
Okay,
I think that's what the spirit of that term is to mean.
okay. Thank you. Representative Owsley?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And not related, kind of related, isolation. Can you give us an example of isolation, or is it defined somewhere? I didn't see it in the memo here. And that could be for Deputy Secretary.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Representative, for the question. Again, when we looked at other states, this was used a few times. I do think it could reflect, the spirit could reflect different circumstances. There are some families who, maybe because of geography or other circumstances, they are isolated from their community. Perhaps they're not coming into town weekly or every day to interact with their community. So you could be isolated geographically, isolated socially. You might have a parent who is parenting by themselves and they are isolated in terms of their ability to connect with peer parents, or their children are not, either because of age or other circumstances. The children might not be going to childcare. They might not be attending school, and the children could be isolated. So I think the spirit of the word, although I have not seen it defined in the other states that we borrowed this from, could mean a number of circumstances in terms of the word isolation.
See, I guess I was thinking like lack of supervision. Could that possibly be considered isolation?
That'd be abandonment, lack of supervision, or?
Lack of supervision is,
Abandonment, I don't know. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Representative. Lack of supervision is a specific definition within neglect. So it has its own number, I believe. Perhaps it's number 2. I apologize, I didn't bring the whole code with me. So it has its own. I think the spirit of the term isolation in this context would be the family's isolation from others or a child's isolation from others.
Thank you.
Okay, Representative Barth.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Actually, this is isolation. I just want to make sure that definition-wise I'm understanding too. So what about a child who has been, you hear the stories on the news where they were kept in like a dog kennel or trapped in like a little room where they weren't allowed to come out of it and locked. Is that isolation, or does that fall under a different legal definition? Because if isolation, to me, if that's it, I'd want that to be alone as a category accepted.
Do you have an answer, Representative or Deputy Secretary Keys?
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representative. Depending on the circumstance, it may fall within one of the 2 categories of neglect. It's also possible, given a scenario, it might fall under the definition of physical abuse. It may just depend on the circumstances that are described. This bill is about the definition of neglect, or that section is about the definition of neglect. Physical abuse has its own definition.
That's what I was thinking. And also, even if it was isolation, that scenario would not be one thing alone. So there would be more than one factor. I'm sure. Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, we look towards definitions. Social isolation negatively impacts your mental and physical health. It leads to depression, anxiety, and substance abuse. And you might experience this anxiety or panic when you're thinking about social interactions. And we do know that historically in certain rural areas, there was severe negative reactions in our own state out in areas where they were isolated by distance and transportation, et cetera. Thank you.
So are we thinking that isolation needs to remain in here? As that it's not based solely on isolation? Representative Riley?
Well, I like the additional definition of social isolation to that, just from my point of view.
Other thoughts? Representative Owsley?
Just comments. When we were Children and Seniors Committee years and years ago, we had a bill prohibiting seclusion and restraint as punishments from schools. And that's what I think of when you talk about, the plywood, room. So I would think that would not follow under isolation. But knowing that we have geographic portions of the state that are frontier, they're not even rural, I don't see how, unless if cows count as company, somebody could not be isolated. So I don't have a problem as leaving it in here as not a single cause for, yes, thank
For
you.
removal? Okay. Anybody else on this amendment? Anyone else? Okay, that is my 3 amendments. Are there others amendments that anybody would like to offer for discussion? Representative Owsley?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I don't have an amendment, but as a previous representative said, we could take advantage of the opportunity. House Bill 2302 would, and I don't have this as an amendment form, but it is in a bill draft, but it would, under reasons for removal through law enforcement, it would read that, how do I read this?
Hold just a second. HB 2302 is in our committee. It's assigned to our committee. It was brought by Representative Owsley. You can find it on the webpage, but we have not heard it or discussed it. Correct.
And I'm putting it out here for discussion because it's come up almost in line with the spirit of 2132. And it just merely mandates that children or DCF has to be available 24/7 to law enforcement when a law enforcement officer reasonably believes the child will be harmed if not immediately removed from the place or residence where the child has been found. So that would go on to read with 2302, after such law enforcement officer is contacted and received a response from the Secretary of Children and Families and consulted with the Secretary about taking the child into custody. And then the second part of it just says the Secretary of Children and Families shall maintain operations outside of the Secretary's operating hours to provide a response and an opportunity for consultation for a law enforcement officer who may take a child into custody pursuant to subsections listed above. It seems to go with the intent of the underlying bill, and I think could enhance it as well. And like I say, I'm just putting it out there for committee discussion. I don't have an amendment planned. It's just right here in my note pile altogether.
Okay, so this is part of the law that addresses relating to Secretary of Children and Families requiring a law enforcement officer to contact and consult with the Secretary. So it's talking about police protective custody. Is that correct, Jesse? Okay, that is correct. So this is the law addressing the statutes on police protective custody. That's what he has offered to change. There are a couple of words that probably need to change in this statute. If we do that, a law enforcement officer shall take a child under 18 years of age into custody when the officer, and then it goes into this stuff. That shall should probably be may, and let them use judgment so that they can do that. So that's one of the thoughts I had on this bill. Representative Humphries, your light is on. No, you're good.
Was there a fiscal note with that bill?
There is a fiscal note with the bill. Originally, my intent was to just get that fiscal note. State general funds, 666,000. All total expenditures, 692,000.
Thank you.
That is online. You can see that online with the bill. Representative Esau?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wouldn't want the fiscal note to hang up the bill, but I like what he's trying to do as long as it fits in with the, in the parts of the statute, as long as it's all connected well enough, because that's definitely a concern that comes up a lot.
Well, Madam Chair, and committee, if the committee decides that this is worthy of its own hearing and, its own discussion as well, I completely understand. I don't like making laws without having everybody at the table, but I feel like this one's right at hand. And in most conversations that I've had regarding 2132, it's been applicable and it's come up.
Other discussion, questions? I will say I'm going to push back just a little bit. I think I want a little more time with this. I love the idea. I think it's something that needs to happen. It's just how do we do that? There are several options that we can take. I did visit with the DCF grant-funded positions in Sedgwick County with that are on staff with the police force. They're doing a phenomenal job. So maybe it's not DCF that does this, maybe it's, equipping police departments to hire social workers that can do that. Maybe that's a better response team because they're on the team and they're there. These two ladies I've worked for several years and they are 24/7. They answer calls every night. They answer calls on vacation. They do not answer calls when they are out of the country. That is the only time they do not answer calls. And they said they could not remember the last time they slept through the night. So it was a very, very good conversation with them. Representative Neighbor.
We have a program in many places in Kansas called CIT, where the police officers have received more training and they call in a social worker when they go to a home to, first of all, try to de-escalate what is going on. But at that time, it's worked very well, I know, in Johnson County. And there is training out there, and I don't know if our police Grand Noble has worked a lot with that, but that seems to be something that would certainly cover that because they cover it 24/7.
I do think this is a conversation we need to have and probably a whole hearing, honestly, to make sure we are doing this. I don't want to just spend money to try to fix a problem. I want to do it with a lot of thought and intent behind it, which is why we're really spending time on this bill. Okay, any other amendments or discussion on this bill? This is a lot to consider. This is going to change child welfare, has potential to change. I have a couple of other DAs that are going to be weighing in between now and Wednesday, so I might have more information for you, but we'll see what they say. I am trying to work with all sides, trying to get the information we need to make the best decision. Representative Riley, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sure I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, you're good.
But are you implying that you don't want to see any more amendments, that this is it?
No.
Okay, thank you.
No, I'm not. Yeah. Well, you can bring more amendments on Wednesday if we need to. if you could give me a heads up, just so I want to work this, it's a big bill, a lot of changes. I want to do it in kind of an orderly fashion if we can. So that would be great if you can give me a heads up. Other than that, we need to think about, just to review, recap, what words we want to use. Likelihood, reasonable suspicion, something else, imminent harm, harm, immediate harm. What are those words? Refusal, or unreasonable failure and refusal, or unreasonable failure period, or failure. Okay, there's probably some other options out there as well. Those are the best ones I can come up with. And then just the standalone policies. I think if we leave in isolation, it seems like that was a good discussion. Changing substance abuse to non-felony substance abuse without harm. Taking out, with Representative Humphrey's amendment, prenatal drug and alcohol exposure. May consider, and then anything else that we need to look at. It's our job. That's our job to do this. This is a heavy lift, but we got this. We got a great team here. Good discussion today. I really appreciate it. There are minutes that Judy sent out. Did everybody get a chance to review those? Do I have a motion? Representative Johnson.
I move approval of the minutes as submitted by our secretary.
Okay. Second by Representative Neighbor. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, nay. Ayes have it. Motion carries. Okay, is there anything else? Do you have any questions, or is there anything you would like for me to have answered Wednesday in committee concerning this bill? Concerning life, I can't help you. Concerning this bill, I can probably help you. Okay, with that, we're adjourned.